Hello, hi everyone. Welcome to MJH Live, the online public program series of the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust in New York City. My name is Samantha Shokin, Manager of Public Programs, and it is my pleasure to introduce today's book talk on The Lost Family, How DNA Testing is Upending Who We Are by award-winning journalist Libby Copeland. In the book, Libby considers the ramifications of consumer genetic testing, exploring the culture of genealogy buffs, the science of DNA, and the business of companies like 23andMe, all while tracing the story of one woman, her unusual results, and a relentless drive for answers that becomes a modern genetic detective story. So interviewing Libby today is journalist and genealogist Jennifer Mendelsohn. Jennifer serves on the board of the Jewish Genealogy Society of Maryland and is the administrator of Facebook's Jewish Genetic Genealogy Group. A member of the Association of Professional Genealogists, Jennifer is the creator of the movement known as Resistance Genealogy, a project that uses genealogical and historical records to fight disinformation and honor America's immigrant past. So before we get started, I just want to make a couple quick notes. We will have time for audience Q&A at the end of the program, the last 15 or 20 minutes or so. So if you have a question that you'd like to ask our speakers, make sure to enter it into the chat box and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. Once again, this program is being recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube in the next day or so. And I'll be sure to send out a link to that recording and to Libby's book for purchase, which is available for purchase on Amazon and bookshop.org. I'll send that follow-up email out in the next day. And finally, I'd like to just thank our partners, jewishgen.com, who helped us put this wonderful program together. So without further ado, welcome Libby and Jennifer.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. We're so thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled to be in this incredible virtual venue and to be here with Jennifer. So it's a treat.
Same here. I'm thrilled to see so many people here today. It's obvious that Libby's book is about a subject that is of great interest and broad interest to a lot of people for a lot of different reasons. And I think it's a subject that there can be a lot of misconceptions about. So it's great to have this opportunity to talk to Libby about the incredible book that she's put out and straighten out some misconceptions and set the record straight. As I've said to you before, Libby, I feel like every talk we do needs to start with an expression of gratitude to you for writing this book because as some of you know, I'm a relatively late convert to the world of genealogy. I spent most of my career as a journalist, and when I entered this world of genealogy, I was so sort of horrified to see how much bad reporting there was on the world of genealogy, because as I was sort of participating in it at the genealogist level, I was watching it being written about from the outside, and I was like, no, they got that all wrong. So I always want to tip my hat to you for writing this book that is so responsible and thoughtful and sort of sets the record straight on so many controversial and difficult subjects. So we'll start from there. But to kick us off, let's talk about how the book came to be. Can you tell us a little bit about sort of where the germ of the idea came from and how it ended up progressing from there?
Yeah, so I'm a longtime journalist, and I write and freelance about a lot of topics, and one of the main things I'm interested in is the intersection of science and culture, and specifically how technology can kind of push human behavior. So I was very interested in that, and actually Jennifer plays a role in the origin story of my book.
Okay, it was a loaded question.
Right, she's a bit of a fairy godmother, as it says in the acknowledgments for my book, because as a journalist and a genealogist, she knew a story when she saw one, and she became interested in the topic of how, you know, the surprises that sometimes arise when you're testing your DNA, when you spit into that tube after you've paid $99, can really be a profound and earth-shattering change in people's lives. And she was having that observation over and over again. She mentioned it to my editor at the Washington Post. My editor at the Washington Post came to me and said, you know, you like writing about this area. Can you find us a story that's really interesting that tells the bigger story of DNA surprises? So that's sort of how this started. I wrote a story back in 2017 when, believe it or not, like many fewer people had done DNA testing. And so the story's become much bigger now because there's so many more people in the databases, but 3 years is a very long time in this world of this technology. So I wrote a story and the story kind of just blew up. And I started getting emails like the moment that it published on the Post website and went into print, I started getting literally hundreds of emails. And they were emails like, you know, DNA testing changed my life. Let me tell you how. Really, really long descriptions, heartfelt, really moving stories of people's understandings of themselves just being kind of blown apart. And in complicated ways, not good, bad, but very nuanced often, sometimes for the better, sometimes causing great pain, but always kind of a profound change to one's understanding of oneself, one's own family. And that's when I started to get the idea that this could be a book, because I think once you go from a few people being affected to a few communities being affected to this being a widespread phenomenon across America and other countries as well, you're really talking about a social change, a seismic change to culture and to the way people think. And I was seeing people grappling on an individual level with questions about like ethnicity and identity, or fatherhood and identity, or what makes a father, right? And questions about family and DNA versus who was there to raise you. And all of these questions, which I thought were really quite beautiful in the ways that people expressed them to me in their stories, those stories became the backbone of this book. And so I try in this book to tell stories from a lot of different stakeholders. There's adoptees who've been using DNA testing since really the beginning to find their birth families because they can't otherwise they can't access their original birth certificates. There's donor conceived people finding their siblings and their donor fathers. And there's people who experience something called an NPE, a non-paternity event, or a not parent expected, where they find out that, one or both of their parents isn't genetically related to them. And there's also people whose own genetic ancestries have been hidden from them for different reasons, by mistake, by historical trauma, by the forces of assimilation or sort of ethnic erasure. And I was really interested in that. And what I think ultimately it boils down to is, these are, when you spit into a tube, it's you may get nothing sort of shocking. You may just get an incredible enhancement of your understanding of family history, which is what we got. But the things that we are all grappling with, and in particularly the people who find surprises, are essential questions that all of us as human beings think about. So even if you never do DNA testing, or even if you do DNA testing, you just find, oh, this is helping me break through this genealogy brick wall, and this is great, but it's just helping me 3 generations back. These questions of what makes us who we are and our perspective on the world and how we define our families are basically essential human questions, and they're incredibly important.
Okay, so 5 minutes in and we're at essential human questions. Who am I? What are the meaning of life? I think this is going well. Let's, okay. I want to talk specifically about the story that you told in the Washington Post, but I think I'm going to hold on to that for a moment and just take a step back. So we are at a moment now in 2020 where consumer DNA testing has been around for about 20 years at this point. Can you tell us a little bit about sort of the industry and its scope and how it started and how it's different than it was 20 years ago?
Yeah, so DNA testing is pretty much exactly 20 years old, like you say. There's a company down in Houston, Texas, that founded and sent out the first kits back in April of 2000. And those first kits were different than the kind of DNA testing that's available now, and the results were different and in many ways could tell you less about your immediate family and your immediate forebears. But that was the beginning of it. And about 10 years in, so around 2010, depending on the company, you started seeing autosomal DNA testing, which is the kind of testing that you generally will encounter if you're testing at a major company. So 23andMe, Ancestry DNA, MyHeritage, Family Tree DNA. And again, this is a category that's recreational DNA testing. So these are the ads that you see that are like, find out who you are, get your ethnicity pie chart that'll tell you you're 25% Swedish and half Ashkenazi Jewish. So that is a sort of a subset of the larger field, and there's other aspects that have to do with health testing and so on that we sort of are putting to the side for the moment. So about 10 years ago is when you start to see autosomal DNA testing. And with that comes two important factors. One is these pie charts I just referred to. They can sort of tell you clues about your genetic ancestry anywhere from a few hundred to about 1,000 years ago. And the other is genetic relatives. So who are your kin? And many of us who've done this have had the experience of looking at these long lists of thousands of relatives sometimes and saying, I have no idea who these people are. And especially in the early days, you were really likely to just get, maybe third cousins. But these days you get, if the databases are pretty big. So, early on, you're talking about maybe 1 million people in the databases overall back in 2013. And nowadays, there's at least 30 million people spread across these 4 databases. So what that means is if you have a really big database, you're more likely to find a close relative. So you're more likely to find out that you have a first cousin that maybe you don't know about. As I tell in the book, the story of a woman who discovers she has, for instance, a first cousin who's given up for adoption. You're more likely to find out that you perhaps have a half sibling you didn't know about. You're more likely to find out that, that you're not genetically related to your dad, perhaps because your dad tested, or perhaps because somebody you don't know is showing up as your aunt, as your genetic aunt. So these are all kind of clues that you can use to piece together understanding, sometimes going back if you're researching your family history and you're trying to better understand it, but sometimes also in your immediate family.
How big a business is consumer DNA testing?
Yeah, so it's 30 million people at this point, at least. It's definitely, for the history of it so far, the main selling point of this industry has been, as far as I can tell, this idea that you can understand your family or get your ethnicity. There's been recently more of a pivot towards health-related testing. But the ancestry and the idea of knowing your own story, find out more about who you are, that's sort of been driving the business. And it's a significant business.
Is there a number you're going to throw out in terms of revenue? That's what I was going for.
Revenue, that's a good question. I could look it up. I probably have it in my book. It's been a while since I've looked it up. Yeah.
I keep thinking that, the subtitle of the book is talking about how this is changing who we are. Is there something zeitgeisty going on that you think makes this desire to know ourselves so huge at this particular moment?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think, there's a sociologist at the University of Pennsylvania named Wendy Roth, and she's done some research looking at who tests and why, and how is this testing different if you, for instance, come from a white European American background versus like an African American background. And she's found that in a lot of cases, European Americans who are testing are often disconnected from their roots. So if their families came over many generations ago, they might not have a very good sense of where their families came from. And there's often a sense of kind of seeking. Some testers described it to her as they found their whiteness boring. And they wanted to understand better and kind of affiliate themselves with the traditions that they had come so very far from, right? So, I mean, people come here traditionally, particularly in past generations, there was this heavy assimilation process that went on. And that meant that you lost your language, maybe you lost your traditions, maybe you lost your religion. And so there's a lot of people, and you see this like in the culture, you see, Finding Your Roots on PBS. There's, you know, Who Do You Think You Are? There's a ton of shows right now that are tapping into this idea that you can get back to the past. And DNA testing is a real incredible immediacy to it. So for instance, like my dad had been doing his genealogy going back to the 1980s, I want to say, since before the internet and that kind of thing. And he did DNA testing, and we all did DNA testing as a family within the last few years. And he was able to find Swedish cousins who we would never have found without this. And we went to Sweden and met them. So, I mean, this idea that you could, his grandmother came over from Sweden in the late 1890s. That's a long time ago. I don't know anyone who was alive in the 1890s, right? And yet, is it really that long ago if we could go back and my dad and his sister could meet their second cousin, right? And in fairness, and you know this better than I, being a genealogist, not every family is going to get those kind of results. So on my mother's side, we're Ashkenazi Jewish, and it can be more complicated to research that for reasons we can get into. And I get into that a lot in the book, the complications of being Ashkenazi Jewish and doing your genetic genealogy. But you do get this sense like all of a sudden maybe we're not so far away from that, and that makes history less abstract. I think it's an incredible gift.
Yeah, I always say, I had an incredible experience where actually 3 times now, DNA matches have led me to the siblings of my great-grandparents who we knew nothing about, did not know that they had siblings. And I always joke, it's like the fast pass at Disney that like gets you to the front of the line. In one case, I joke I could have spent the rest of my known days on Earth tracking down every Fleischman in the phone book in America, but because I got this DNA match to a guy named Fleischman, it led me to my Fleischmans, and it's really, really exciting. I'm seeing a lot of questions come up in the chat. We're gonna hold questions till the end, so don't be concerned. And a lot of the things you're asking about are things that we're going to discuss over the next half hour or so. So don't worry. Okay, so we've talked generally about testing, but your book is not about the phenomenon of testing sort of generically. It's more specifically about the phenomenon of finding out things that you did not expect to find through testing, which is sort of an unexpected consequence of making these tests available. So let's talk a little bit about that. I know you have some interesting numbers on how many people get an unexpected result. And let's talk, we'll get to Alice, but let's talk about some of the varieties of surprises that people get. Right. I know one that I found really interesting was the story of Linton in your book, and how she believed that she had Ashkenazi heritage, which she believed put her at risk medically, and that impacted her in a very important way, only to learn that that was actually not her genetic heritage. So let's talk about the surprise factor from spitting into that tube.
Sure. So and Linda's like kind of the, she's just a whole bunch of surprises kind of bundled up into one. And it was very shattering for her. And also a relief, if that can make any sense. So Linda was adopted, but she was not told that she was adopted. And she found out through an Ancestry DNA test. But the complicating factor was that she had just had a radical hysterectomy. And part of the reason was she had symptoms, she had testing, she had all sorts of issues that made her, what appeared to be an illness, and made the doctor very concerned and saying that she needed surgery. But she also had this complicating factor, she believed, of Ashkenazi Jewish heritage and a family health history she had gotten from her mother. And all of it added together was very concerning. And so to discover 2 weeks after having this radical hysterectomy that the Ancestry DNA results indicated that not only did she not have Ashkenazi Jewish, ancestry, but she was adopted, was just completely mind-blowing. And so you do see cases where people do discover that they're adopted and didn't know it. It's not that common, but it can happen, especially in, you know, older folks. She was, I think, 51, but especially even older than that, where people were never told. And why do I say it was a relief to her? You know, again and again, I've heard this from the people who discover things about themselves. This is not always the case for people on the other side. The keepers of the secrets are not always happy to have these things come out. But for her, and for the majority of people who I talked to who discovered, for instance, that one or both of their parents wasn't genetically related to them, it was incredibly painful, and they were glad to know the truth, because the truth has such an essential value and it can cast so much illumination on your understanding of who you are and answer questions going back many, many years to your childhood. So you've got late discovery adoptees discovering this way. You've got people discovering that they're donor conceived. People may have read the book Inheritance by Dani Shapiro, which came out last year, and she writes, and Jennifer, by the way, helped her with her case. And that story, you know, she discovers she's donor conceived. Her parents are no longer alive for her to ask questions of. Her father is not genetically related to her. She's got a different man who donated half of her genetic material. So you've got donor conceived people, you have NPEs, non-paternity events, and you have half siblings, the discovery of half siblings, which can either be because you discover your dad's not genetically related to you, or it can be just that, you know, maybe your mom had a child and gave that child up for adoption, or your dad helped conceive a child maybe before your parents were together, or during or after it, you know, all different iterations. So how common is this? So I tried to isolate the number of people I thought had either discovered that they were the product of a non-paternity event or not parent expected event, or that they had a half sibling they didn't know about. And based on my conversations with like population geneticists and genetic genealogists and observers of the industry, it looks like somewhere about 1 million people out of the 30 million people who've tested experience one or both of those things. The number of people affected is much greater, because again, you're talking, I've only looked at a certain subset, but you also have you know, late discovery adoptees, people discovering their genetic ancestry was hidden from them, on and on. You know, I interviewed a woman, she actually isn't in the book, but, you know, the people that she believed to be her parents were actually her grandparents, and her sister was her mother. So, you know, you have all sorts of different iterations. So the number is bigger than 1 million, but it's also bigger for another reason, which is that, you know, if you consider a single secret, how it refracts across a family. So someone like Linda, for instance, her discovery affects her immediate family. It affects her relationship with her mother, the woman who adopted her mother, and her siblings, who knew, but it affects their relationship. But it also affects her relationship with her genetic father, who she's reached out to, and her siblings. I think she has 4 or 5 of them on her paternal side. And then her mother's no longer alive, but her mother's husband and his children, all of whom in her case just didn't want to get to know her. In fact, she got rejections on both sides. She got essentially a cease and desist letter from her father and a letter from her mother's husband calling her deplorable because her mother had just died, and the things that she was saying about being related to this woman were too painful for these people in grief to kind of grapple with or accept, and they did not want to know her. So in Linda's instance, you're talking about 10 or 12 people who are directly impacted by a single test. And so when I talk about the impact of DNA revelations, we're talking about millions of Americans.
Wow. Connected to what you mentioned, I'll throw out that a friend made a great documentary that I think you can find on Netflix called Open Secret. And he was raised on a farm in Kansas, where he was sort of confusingly, as he was a child, he was adopted by a family that already had 7 children. And apparently everybody in the town, this little farm town in Kansas, that's why it's called Open Secret, knew that he was actually the child of his older sister. So
Wow.
he learned when he was 18, the night before he graduated from high school, that he was not in fact the child of this Catholic farm family, and his biological father was a Jewish Holocaust survivor that his older sister had met during the summer of love in California. So that's not a DNA story per se, but it's the same sort of, you know, we talk about the term genealogical bewilderment, and it feels like DNA testing has just made, you know, an epidemic of genealogical bewilderment, but there was plenty of episodes of genealogical bewilderment before DNA as well. Okay, so let's talk about Alice, and you can decide how much of the good secret that Alex uncovered, which is sort of the crux of your whole book, you want to give away. But suffice it to say that in the universe of DNA surprise stories, and I have seen probably about as many of them as anybody out there, it's one of the greatest of all. So why don't we just start by saying that a woman named Alice, who grew up Catholic in New York City, took a DNA test and was shocked to discover that she was half Jewish, and she called Ancestry irate that they had made a mistake. And then she took a second test that confirmed the same thing. There's Alice.
There's Alice.
So let's talk about, without giving too much away, let's talk about what you found out, or what Alice found out.
So, okay, so Alice tests in 2012. Databases are really small. There's not a lot of close relatives you can find. But what first strikes her about her results, and she's a genealogist and she's been doing her family history for a long time, is like you say, the ethnicity pie chart is not what it is supposed to be based on what she understands about her family. So she knows her Irish roots going back pretty far on her mom's side, Irish Scottish on her mom's side, Irish on her dad's. She knows a little less far back, but she knows it. She's done the research that she can. And she is, you know, just totally bewildered by this pie chart that says half Irish British Isles and half Ashkenazi Jewish. And she's so confounded that she at first, she has taken this test through Ancestry. And by the way, Ancestry DNA had just unveiled its test. Like it was in beta testing when she took it. So she's just like, well, they don't know what they're doing yet. And she writes a little email to their customer service team. And she's like, you guys don't know what you're doing yet because I'm Irish. And how could you give me this result? And well, it turns out that they're not wrong. She's wrong. And this story of how she understands how and why she came to be wrong is the kind of detective story, I guess you would say, that kind of like pushes you through. Like I think it's like an existential mystery, right? Because it's a kind of a whodunit, but the who and the done, all of that is really about like selfhood. So anyway, long story short, I won't tell you what the explanation is, but I will say what it's not. So a lot of times when people test and they get, you know, they understand that they're entirely Italian American, or they understand that they're half this and half that, and they get a result that's drastically different than they expected. A lot of times the explanation is that perhaps their father isn't genetically related to them. It's not that. And she kind of, what she winds up doing is she kind of goes through all the theories one by one. Very methodically, because the thing about Alice is that she's very analytical. She's incredibly smart. She's very tech savvy. She had just retired and she had worked in information systems, like data processing and information management. You know, like she knew spreadsheets and she knew all sorts of ways to kind of like corral data. And she had done that for her whole career. So she comes upon this puzzle when she's retired and she's like, okay, data, I've got data, I can solve the problem. Let me build some spreadsheets. And she starts like going crazy building spreadsheets, trying to understand her own identity based on her genetic relatives. And it takes her 2.5 years of full-time work. And this is a challenge that existed back then that nowadays wouldn't be such a challenge. But even just 8 years ago, because of the relatively small size of the databases, she's working with very distant cousins. So like fourth cousins, third cousins, and it's very hard to solve the mystery. But as she goes, she she kind of tests one theory and is able to dismiss it, tests another theory and is able to dismiss it. And that narrative allows me to then also give examples of what it looks like when it does turn out to be a non-paternity event, or when it does turn out to be that you're adopted and you weren't told. So when I got the emails in response to the story that ran in 2017 in the Washington Post, I started talking to those people and interviewing those people, and many of those people's stories wound up in the book, and they kind of go alongside Alice's story, which propels you through. And I show you, like, what does it look like to be someone who experiences this, and what does it look like, and how does the person on the other side react? How do fathers who discover they conceived children back and didn't know it, or maybe did know it, and didn't have a relationship with that child, like, how do they react now? What is the kind of the landscape of responses that people can give? I know you see this a lot in your work, but, like, you kind of can't predict how people are going to respond. Some people respond with open arms and great warmth and empathy. Some people, it's like a direct threat to their marriage or their relationships with their children, or at least that's how they see it. And it's a roulette wheel of unpredictability.
That's a good way to put it. I mean, I have personally seen every possible stop along the spectrum, from the angry cease and desist letter to the, I just got a birthday card saying "love you, sister" from the person that I didn't know, 6 months ago. So it's fascinating. But Alice also allows us to talk about another important part of the book and of this world, because Alice connected with a woman named Cece Moore, who, 6 months ago, probably no one in this chat would have recognized her name, but we now know that she is the star of a new ABC television show called The Genetic Detective. But Alice sort of stumbled into this world of, I want to say underground, but that makes it sound seedy. But there is this whole sort of network of largely volunteer people doing this sort of puzzle solving. What did you learn about that world?
Yeah. It's fascinating. So there are a lot of genetic genealogists like Cece Moore, and I interviewed her quite a bit for the book. And there are a lot of, there's a sort of a subset of them who are known as search angels, and they will often volunteer their time for, say on behalf of an adoptee or a person seeking their genetic parent, to help them unravel their results and figure this out. There's, multiple skills involved in understanding how to do your own genetic genealogy to, say, find an immediate family member. And it's not just looking at your DNA results and boom, there's the answer. In an ideal world, sometimes it might work like that. But a lot of times, as you know well, because you do a lot of this genetic genealogy work, you have to do the genealogy, and that can actually be the hard part, depending on how far back you have to go. And you have to have an ear and an eye for, as I learned, I don't do it myself, but as I learned reporting it, interviewing people, you have to know where the records are. You have to know what records you can trust. You have to know who, sometimes other people have trees that aren't vetted as well, and you can't
use other people's trees.
Yeah. So this is a whole incredible world that I was just so fascinated to kind of delve into and to interview genetic genealogists. They have newsletters, and there's terminology that unless you are in this world, you will not know what they mean. And it's so cool. And it's like this fabulous, fascinating, nerdy in a good way, hobby that, is a kind of like a gift in many ways to people, right? Because like if you can't do it, if you don't have the mind for it, and you've talked to me before about the kind of puzzle solving mind you have to have, you just kind of look at it's completely overwhelming. But if you have the sixth sense for it and the experience, and maybe a particular kind of records and a particular that you have familiarity with a particular ethnicity or whatever, it's like magic to watch someone unravel. It's amazing.
There's nothing like it. It's like somebody will come to you, an adoptee, and they want to know who their biological parents are, and they hand you their results, which mean nothing to them. And at the end of it, you can come back with a name, and it's very satisfying. It can be crazily frustrating sometimes, because sometimes these puzzles are really, really thorny to solve. And we should probably speak to that. I think I saw a question scroll by. Let's talk about what made Alice's search particularly difficult. You can speak to that, I can speak to that, but why is it more complicated for people with Ashkenazi heritage?
Right. So there's a few reasons. So one of the reasons has to do with the history of close marriage within the community, and sometimes like cousins marrying cousins. And when that happens over and over, over a long time, and it's not just true for Ashkenazi Jews, there's other groups of people who have this experience as well. It's called endogamy. So if you have an endogamous community, what happens is that people are interrelated. They're related to each other in more than one way. So we have it in my family with, like, I think my mom, if she's listening, will be annoyed that I can't remember, but it's, two sisters marrying two brothers, or first cut. And I think we have it along multiple lines, and I'm sure we're not. And it goes back. It goes way back like that. So what does that mean? So part of the way that I know I'm related to someone is that you and I share some genetic segments of a certain length. They have to be a certain length to be, kind of reliable. And when you come from an endogamous community, you wind up with many short shared genetic segments that reflect not necessarily like a third cousin relationship, but maybe multiple distant cousin relationships all at the same time. So it looks like you're more closely related to me than I am. And what that does, that inflation of relationship prediction, means that I look like I have many more close cousins in a database, as do you. And I also look like I'm related to, more closely related to other Ashkenazi Jews than I am. In fact, there's a line in the book, I think I quote you talking about, you see any two Jews walking down the street, you can assume that they'll look like they're related in a database. They're distantly related. And
I'll throw out one important stat that I always cite. Bennett Greenspan, the founder of FTDNA, confirmed to me that 3/4 of the Jewish testers in their database match each other. So if you tested FTDNA, 75% of Jews who test at DNA are genetic matches at some level, usually distant to the other Jewish. So, and I'll just add to what you're saying, that one important part of this process, and I think it might be helpful to explain that the way that you find birth family, or let's say someone tests and they discover that their father is not their biological father, and they have no idea who their actual biological father is. It might be helpful to just understand the process. So when somebody like me takes a DNA test, I know who my parents are, I know who my grandparents are, my genetic testing confirms that that is correct. When I get my match list, I have a random assortment of people who happen to have taken a test who say that they share DNA with me at various levels. Oh, my first cousin took a test. Look, they're on there as my first cousin. My second cousin took a test. He's on there as my second cousin. A bunch of my third cousins tested, right? So I have all those names and I know how they fit in my tree, right? When a person with unknown parentage tests, what we, genetic genealogists, do is use that match list, which is a list of people and they have no idea who they are, and we reverse engineer a tree for them based on the people on that match list. And what's incredibly frustrating is when you do that for somebody who's not from an endogamous community, you can use the shared matches to build that tree, because you can see, oh, this person shares DNA with X, they must be related this way. But so many Jews share so much DNA with each other that everybody is often a shared match with everybody, and that doesn't, so you can't use the shared matches to tell you where these people fit. So it's a much, much, much more complicated process to do it for somebody who's Jewish. So for Alice, who was trying to find this unknown, Jewish grandfather, it's much more frustrating and complicated. So I just wanted to
it's like hunting for a needle in a haystack for her. And she winds up understanding that she and her siblings are related to something like 6,000. They wind up at the time looking at like 6,000 apparent genetic cousins. And they're looking for like that one sliver of DNA. It's like 300,000 shared little slivers of DNA that they're looking for, like the one that will explain it all. And so when I say it took 2.5 years and she had to build databases, like, and again, if she had not been from an endogamous community, I'm sure it would have been much easier.
Yeah, but I hate to be too pessimistic. It can be done. I've done it many times for people with unknown Jewish parents, but it's not easy, and it's much easier when you're not from an endogamous community. So I feel like we should probably touch on the issue of privacy, which seems to sort of hover in the air around this whole issue, and maybe even gestured to the use of DNA databases for law enforcement, and that's sort of a whole new ripple in this world. Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah. We were talking about Cece Moore earlier, and this new show she's got, The Genetic Detective. She is somebody who went from working as a search angel to helping law enforcement when they have crime scene DNA, and in many cases this is crime scene DNA going back decades, because they're usually doing this for the like most frustrating cases, the ones that they couldn't solve any other way. So sometimes these are homicides and sexual assaults from 70s, 60s. I think there's even one from the 50s. And I think there's one even farther back than that. And what they're doing is they're basically doing what search angels have long done, but they're doing it in a different way by putting the crime scene DNA into a kind of a public database. So they're not doing it through the companies, generally speaking, that we're familiar with, like Ancestry, 23andMe, and MyHeritage. They're doing it through a kind of a public, semi-public database called GEDmatch, or through there's one private company that does do this called Family Tree DNA. And there's levels of opting in, and there's certainly an amount of control that you have over this. And they're doing this process. They're finding, second, third cousins for the unknown suspect, and then they're figuring out the identity of the suspect that way. And that started in 2018 with the Golden State Killer case, which many people probably heard of. What they might not know is that has continued. And at least the last time I looked, I think there were over 90 cases, primarily cold cases, but sometimes more recent cases that have been solved this way. And it has sparked somewhat of a debate over, whether this is the right thing to do, whether this is the right thing to do with DNA that was, collected for recreational purposes. Is this an invasion of privacy? Is this surveillance state? You see all those kind of privacy debates playing out over this. And yet I would say, I think the data that I've seen from surveys is that the majority of Americans does not feel strongly that they wanted this to stop. So it's continued, and it's continued for the most egregious cases, which is probably a smart idea on part of law enforcement, as well as a pragmatic one, because it costs money to do this. So it's not like you can do this easily do this for lesser cases. So that's one privacy aspect. There are many other privacy aspects, and I do talk about them in the book, sort of having to do with, will you suffer genetic discrimination as a result of doing DNA testing? Could you in the future? What happens if your data is breached? But I think one of the biggest privacy questions is the one that's sort of at the center of the thinking and research that I've been doing, which is what happens within a family? What happens, for instance, when somebody wants to know their parent and their parent doesn't want to be known? How do people reconcile it when we are intimately genetically related, and yet my interests seem to be in clashing with yours? So it's a fascinating question, and it's not easily answered.
For sure. And I think also maybe this is implicit in everything we've been talking about, but just to make it explicit for a moment, people need to realize that, let's say hypothetically, an adoptee takes a test and they match to a first cousin. meaning this person is the child of one of their biological parents' siblings, well, then that first cousin is aware that their aunt or uncle is the parent of a child who was placed for adoption. That aunt or uncle may still be alive. What does that first cousin do with this information? It's sort of, because we're all, as you say in the book, you don't have to have taken a test for this to be an issue. It can impact you just because you're related to somebody who does take a test. So it's this whole web of.
And you don't have to have, so for instance, if you are a man who maybe unknown to you conceived a child 50 years ago, you don't need to test to find that out.
Exactly.
If your genetic child is looking for you, and they test this way, there's a high chance they'll be able to find you, whether or not you tested, because your second cousin tested.
Exactly.
So
I think it's time for us to take questions. Samantha, are you going to relay those to us to the chat? Should we just look at the chat and answer them?
Yeah, I've been sort of collecting questions that have been coming in, so I'll just pick a few here in the time that we have remaining. This is a question about the accuracy of testing agencies that you mentioned. One individual writes that companies that tested the same individuals can come up with completely different results, and how can those results be trusted?
You want to take that, Libby?
Well, there's different kinds of results that we're talking about here, right? There's relative results, which are very reliable. So pretty much, with the exception of this issue of endogamy we've been talking about, where sometimes a more distant relation may look like a third cousin if you happen to be Ashkenazi Jewish. Okay, putting that to the side, someone shows up as your genetic father, that's what they are. And sometimes they can't make the perfect prediction about what the kind of relationship is, but the degree of relatedness is very reliable. That's distinct from an ethnicity estimate. And those results vary from company to company because they have their own methods, they have their own algorithms for determining what percent Scottish you are, and they have their own reference population, which is a group of people that are supposed to stand in for all the people of Scotland. And how can all those people stand in? Well, it's imperfect. They can do pretty good job, but you might vary from company to company. So one company will tell you have a little bit of this, more of this, and another company has trouble telling whether it's French or German because the borders are porous. And it's not as if people stayed in one place, and it's not as if borders never changed, and it's not as if there was never migration and war. So they're pretty good, but you got to take it with a grain of salt.
Right. I just want to add, I forget exactly how the question was phrased, but it said something like you can get vastly different results. You can't get vastly different results. I mean, you get shades of gray, slightly there. If you are Ashkenazi Jewish, there is no reputable DNA company that is going to tell you that you are Southeast Asian. It just doesn't happen. There might be a small percentage that they ascribe one way than another company, but the big picture is mostly accurate. But I want to get to other questions, but it's also really important. Ethnicity estimates are just that. They're estimates. They're not measuring something scientific like the pH of a liquid or the temperature of a solid. That is something that you can put a thermometer in and it's going to tell you the answer. So it's not that part is not an exact science, but the cousin matching is.
Thank you guys so much. This next question addresses the endogamy issue that you touched upon with like different sets of siblings marrying each other, which created a genetic bottleneck. So with that, would you say that it is still worthwhile for Ashkenazi Jews to test, since a lot of these results can be maybe not misleading, but confusing in how accurately they portray relations between individuals?
I would say absolutely. Sorry, Libby, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, no, I would agree with you. I mean, I'll just give a personal example, and I know Jennifer has stories about this too, but like we were able to find a second cousin. As I said, my mother is Ashkenazi Jewish. We were able to find her second cousin from Ukraine. And we had not known that any of the branches there survived World War II. So, you know, and Jennifer can probably talk to this more, but like what we're talking about with the issue of endogamy is more so with like third cousins and greater, I think. But, you know, if someone shows up as an aunt, as a first, second cousin, I think, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think those are generally pretty easy to take to the bank. And you can also check them. Like you can, if someone's close, you can build out the tree and figure out exactly how they're related to. Am I right about that, Jennifer?
Yeah, I mean, I generally say endogamy doesn't affect results greater than about 200 centimorgans, which is sort of at the second cousin once removed, okay, give or take level. If you get a close match, that is not endogamy. And to answer the question, I mean, I think I spoke to this earlier when I said it's like a Disney fast pass. Absolutely, DNA testing, if you're interested in genealogy and you're Jewish, is worthwhile. The part that people don't like is that it's not a magic bullet. It's not going to, you know, you're not going to test and get all the answers. It won't tell you exactly where in Eastern Europe your great grandparents came from. What I always say is you have to work in tandem. The better your paper tree, the more you can get out of your DNA results, and the better your DNA matches, the more you can build your paper tree. So you have to do both at the same time. One alone is not enough.
Thank you guys for breaking that down. This is a question that kind of delves a bit deeper, maybe for more advanced genealogists, but perhaps you can address this in a way that everyone will be able to understand. One person asks, how helpful are results from mitochondrial DNA? Could you speak a little bit more about the difference in results that you get as a female or a male when you submit your DNA for analysis from one of these agencies?
I think I'll let Jennifer take the mitochondrial DNA because I have not had experience with that.
Mitochondrial,
a little about it, but it's a narrow niche.
So mitochondrial DNA is passed from mothers to children of any children, male and female. And you can take a mitochondrial DNA test and it will trace your mother's line. We could get into a lot of detail, but the short answer is, for genealogical purposes, if you want to know who your third great grandparents from Poland were, mitochondrial DNA is not going to help you. It's going to point to ancestors way beyond genealogical time. If you're interested in your very, 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 very ancient origins, sure, but for the average user, it's not going to give you the sort of information you're looking for.
Got it. Can you check like the Y chromosome lineage if you're a woman, or do you need to like ask your dad to? How does that work?
Yeah, you have to ask your dad to do it, or you can ask your brother to do it. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Women don't have Ys, so we can't test them.
Yeah. Great. So here's a question. I forget how you phrased this. Was it genealogy angels that you mentioned?
Yeah,
search angels.
Search angels, got it. So someone asked how they can get in touch with a search angel if they have specific questions about their ancestry. Is it through one of these websites, or maybe like online groups or anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of places, but the best place is honestly Facebook. There's a group that started a long time ago, actually kind of pre-Facebook or pre the popularity of Facebook, called DNA Adoption. And they're online if you Google them. And they have a lot of search angels who help. Beyond
DNAadoption.com?
Yeah, I think or DNAadoption.org. I forget if it's, or might be both. I think it might go to both. But there's groups on Facebook that are run by genetic genealogists, and there's often search angels within the groups, and they'll often have like documents that kind of lead you through how to know if you need a search angel and how to find one who specializes in, the topic that you're looking for. So there's like a big group called DNA detectives, and then there's subgroups of that for particular things like donor conceived, or if you're a foundling. So if you were someone who was placed on a doorstep. I talk in my book, tell a story about a woman who was placed on a doorstep when she was 4 days old, I should say. She was a foundling. And then Jennifer runs a group. Jennifer, you can talk about your group, but there's many, many flavors. This is just one of them that can help you if you're specifically looking into Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry and search angels there.
Great. And is there like a specific group that, sorry, Jennifer, I didn't mean to interrupt. Just the second part of the question, if there's a specific group or website for Jewish DNA that people can look into?
Yeah, I think you have the link, Samantha, to our group, which is the Jewish Genetic Genealogy group on Facebook. Unfortunately, we don't have a formal search angel operation the way DNA Detectives does. But there are a handful of people who have some experience doing Jewish unknown parent searches, and they're in the group, and they, when they're available, they may be able to take some cases on. I see a comment saying Tracing the Tribe has people who help. Tracing the Tribe is mostly for paper genealogy. So if you're interested in just learning more about your Jewish past and doing your genealogy on paper, Tracing the Tribe is a great group, but their focus is not DNA. People ask DNA questions there, but our group is really only, in fact, we don't allow questions about paper genealogy. We only do Jewish genetic genealogy.
Fascinating, thank you. So we're just about out of time. I want to ask one more question before we close out. Could you address, for those of us who are curious about Sephardic lineage, is there any overlap that can be told in like the genetic DNA between Sephardic and Ashkenazi lines? Or, sorry, if you could just address like any similarities between Sephardic and Ashkenazi DNA.
Well, I really specialize in Ashkenazi. We do, there's some controversy as I understand it. Some people do not believe that there really are Sephardic sequences, meaning that you can identify Sephardic heritage via DNA, but FTDNA and MyHeritage both have Sephardic categories, and they feel confident that they can identify Sephardic DNA. There's also some people, there's different understandings of how big an impact endogamy has in the Sephardic community. So they are separate, but on some, like if a Sephardic person tests at Ancestry, they very often will show Ashkenazi heritage because there is no Sephardic category. So they usually get some sort of mix of Ashkenazi and Iberian and, so.
Very, very interesting. Sorry, Libby, yeah, go ahead.
No.
I think that was me.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
I threw out an and I just wanted to use the opportunity because I saw it in there. Several people threw out my family name was changed at Ellis Island trope, and I'll take 5 seconds to say, if you follow me on Twitter, it's the bane of my existence. No names were changed at Ellis Island, not one. It's not true, even though your grandmother said it happened. There's tons and tons of scholarship on this. I personally have debunked this myth for every single person who's ever thrown it at me. If you follow the paper trail, immigrants change their own names. Nobody changed their names for them. Just had to take that opportunity to say that. And it's an important thing to know if you're doing Jewish genealogy, that's a myth, a very, very, very hard myth to debunk.
Great, you heard it here. Thank you, Libby, Jennifer, so much. That's all the time that we have today. I wish we could continue this conversation because it is so fascinating. But that just gives people a reason to read the book. Please make sure to buy Libby's book, The Lost Family. It's on Amazon and bookshop.org. Go to Bookshop if you want to support independent booksellers. As I mentioned, this program was recorded. It will be uploaded to YouTube. I'll send out that link in the coming days, and in addition to links to Libby's and Jennifer's websites and that book link. A couple things before we sign off. If you enjoyed today's program, please sign up for our newsletter. The Museum of Jewish Heritage is doing public programs online on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, sometimes evenings. So make sure to look out for upcoming programs. I'd like to thank our partners for today, JewishGen.com for introducing me to Jennifer, and for Libby for putting this wonderful program together. Lastly, if you enjoyed today's program, please consider donating to the museum and becoming a member. We so appreciate all of your generosity, and we will continue doing these online public programs when the museum reopens, hopefully this fall. So once again, a big thank you to Libby and Jennifer. This was really fabulous.
Thank you for having us.
It's been such a thrill to be here. Thank you.
Thanks to everyone for joining us.